Okay.
What
So
is a provost?
a provost, I think, is the academic boss.
Yeah.
I don't know, we're recording this, so we'll come back to that later. Okay, I think this is correct. All right. So welcome back to our final session of Unexpected Transmitters of Torah. Just to review the first session, we met the prophetess Huldah, who may have authenticated a scroll, might have been Deuteronomy, although we also saw that in the rabbinic understanding of who she was, it was much more of a rabbinic role as teacher of text. And then last week we met the maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, whose name I still haven't found in any secondary or tertiary literature yet, but that she was, whether she existed or not historically, she was a transmitter of language, and used her knowledge of language and words to explicate Torah. But we also saw that in the story that the rabbis told about her, she was a halachic decider. She made, or a posek in a sense, she made Jewish law for individuals. This week, we're going to meet Dulcie, who was the, I think pretty much, yeah, just a request to mute yourself if you're not speaking. That keeps some of the vibrations or whatever from happening. So Dulcie was the wife of Rabbi Eleaser of Worms, who's also known as the Rokeach. His dates were 1165 to 1230. And they lived in Germany in the 12th century. And of all the women that I've looked at over the couple of years that I've been doing some teaching around these, women, particularly biblical women, Dulcie is actually the only person that we can say definitively is a historical figure. She really existed, and we know that about her. I actually first met Dulcie in 1979. I was a senior at the seminary in the undergraduate school, and kind of created my own women's studies major between JTS and Columbia, and was working on an honors thesis on medieval Jewish women in Sefer Hasidim, which is a book that describes the community that Dulcie lived in, and also worked for I think many of you will know her as taking a class with Dr. Ann Lapidus Lerner. And one of the papers I did was a translation of a poem that was written by her husband, by Rabbi Eleaser of Worms, after her death. She was murdered, and he wrote two accounts or two eulogies about her, one in prose and one in poetry. The prose was in kind of the format of what was an important form of literature in the Middle Ages, of Crusade chronicles, or descriptions about people who kind of became saints, if you will, by virtue of becoming martyrs. And these Crusade chronicles and other kinds of narratives spoke about the lives and deaths of people in medieval Europe, which was not necessarily such a safe place for anyone, but particularly for Jews to live. The other piece which he wrote, which is going to be the focus of our study today, is a poem. And it's unusual. It's based on Proverbs 31, ASHET CHAYIL, which is why I did ask if you had a chance to look at that poem, which you probably know some or all of anyway. But it's unusual in medieval literature, and particularly in medieval poetry, in its specificity. This is not about anybody other than Rabbi Eleaser of Worms's wife, DULCIE. Okay, so and that is not typical of medieval Jewish poetry. So what I want to do is we'll look at the community. We'll look at some things around medieval Jewish women that she teaches us. But I want to start by spending just a little bit of time with Proverbs 31, because I want you to see the relationship and the foundation of the poem that Rabbi Eleaser wrote. So I'm going to share it, I hope. And I want you, I'm not going to read, whoops, go back a bit. I'm not going to read all of Proverbs 31, but I want you to just kind of review it in your head. And as you're looking at it, I want you to think about if, in fact, this woman, as described in Proverbs 31, was a woman. Who was she? What was her life like? What did she do? And what perhaps didn't she do that you might have thought? So you saw the first part. The second part on this, I'm sorry, I didn't make it one long piece, but it should be it should be familiar to you. So many lines. In fact, today's poem is today's Torah Fund pin is Limud. I actually debated because Torah Fund had put out 2 pins that have quotes from ASHET CHAYIL, from a woman of valor. But I decided to go with the Limud because we're going to see a more concrete connection to Torah in DULCIE's life. But you see this sense of and this is a very common poem, spoken about women. So if you want to unmute yourself for at all, just what's your sense of the woman in Proverbs, if she's a woman? What's important to her? What's her power?
I think this is a composite. My mother didn't like this poem at all. She said nobody can be like that. It's like superwoman on steroids. She didn't use those words, but I think it's a composite.
Okay, but even in making this composite, what's important?
She's capable within the household and also in the business world.
Okay. Any other things people see or don't see in this poem?
She's a super mom.
Right. Certainly.
No one person could do everything this woman does in this poem.
Right. And that's a phrase that's often applied to her, particularly, once that phrase became, contemporary and, spoken in contemporary language about all of the expectations.
And Barbara thinks it's very chauvinistic.
Okay. In what way?
The man doesn't do anything.
He doesn't do anything. Okay. So I don't know whether chauvinistic is the right
slave, word. She keeps him in
the way he wants,
comfort and.
Okay.
I think the only thing it doesn't mention is sex.
Okay. Gittel?
He's praying at the gates. Sorry.
This is a woman who is in charge of the whole family, in charge of the whole household. She works so her husband can fetch the bench, and she is just in charge. And she is the one that enables the whole family to survive, because he is not out there working. She is doing everything. He's not working in the house. She is doing everything, as nobody can do it all. But
it certainly seems like
she is the one that's in charge. She is in charge, not the man in this household.
Okay.
But we don't know what he does. This is about her. It's not about him. It talks
about say something about that.
So that the sitting at the gates, right? Sitting at the gates could have been an official public role. Right. It could have been a judge, or it could have. That's where things happened at the gates. So it could have enabled him to do that. But 1 or 2 more comments, and I just want to have it laid out a little bit for you before we get into our main topic. Ellen?
I certainly agree with everything everyone has said. I'm impressed. I have the JTS here too. Not only does she gird her strength, but the use of the word business, right? She what is it? She sets her mind on a vineyard and plants the vineyard. She sees that her business thrives. I mean, someone said as supermom, children are not mentioned until her children declare her happy. She's not a mom at all. She is, I mean, yeah, right. She's probably a mom, but this does not celebrate maternity. This celebrates initiative, drive, worldliness, skill, capacity, intelligence. I mean, for me, this is a woman of valor. The husband does his thing, and I agree that at the gates, that's a very powerful trope, right? At the gates, you're doing something. You're powerful in some relationship to the community. But, everything she's doing is about a fully realized human being in the world, the business. Right. And right. Can I just say, when he's at the gates, her husband is prominent at the gates as he sits among the elders of the land. She makes cloth and sells it and offers a girdle to the merchant. I mean, that juxtaposition, those 4 lines right there sort of says it all.
Okay, Joanne?
Yeah, what strikes me about it is that she seems to be wealthy. It's a wealthy household. She has maids, she has money to go buy things, which is kind of contrasting to other tropes that we have of virtuous women like Rabbi Akiva's wife and people who are poor, but here's somebody who's wealthy and yet she's not lazy.
Right. And so there's a phrase that none of you brought up, or an identity or part of her identity that none of you brought up. Anybody want to guess where I'm going with this, given our topic?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean, but I just noticed something else, and that is she's smart. I just missed a sentence here. She's intelligent and scholarly, and yet the rabbis wouldn't take a woman's word for anything.
Where do you see that she's scholarly?
Oh, I'm down at. It was right after the quote that Ellen Diamond just made.
So her mouth is full of wisdom?
Her mouth is full of wisdom, right?
Yeah. So here's my question for you. Is she Jewish?
That's a good question.
As we would think, Michael? Yeah.
Sure.
Well, she's said to be Yirat Hashem. And that's rather a buzzword.
Right. And some of you might have been on the class I did about Egyptian women in the Exodus, and this question of whether being God-fearing Elohim and Adonai. So it being God-fearing of Adonai certainly is probably a Jewish identity. I'm not saying that she's not Jewish, but I want to, and we could talk about charity, and there might be a few other places where we might see what are traditionally other parts of Jewish and Jewish women's values. But I just wanted to raise that in your head as we're going to look at our heroine for this evening.
Most biblical characters are, especially if they're being praised.
They are what?
Are Jewish.
Right, most of them. Right. And this is the book of Proverbs. Now, I do need to say just a few things about this, although I don't want to spend too much time on it, right? So the book of Proverbs is a piece of wisdom literature, and in wisdom literature, women are not necessarily well thought of. They are tempters. They move men away from wisdom, if you will. Although at the same time, if you think about Greek, and this is not unknown to the biblical authors, Sophia, the word for wisdom is female. The images of wisdom are female. But the question of whether from the beginning is this an epitome, is this a statement of wisdom as opposed to a particular woman? Those are all long debates. You might think by there is a whole section called Midrash Mishlei which Midrash Mishle is a Midrash on Proverbs, which includes this. And within that, each of the 22 verses of Proverbs 31 is associated with a different biblical woman or heroine. And in the course of some of the teaching that we've done over time, we've referred to some of the verses which are attributed to some of the women that we've studied. You might think, though, that one of the reasons that after his wife died, Rabbi Eleaser used the structure of Proverbs 31. Certainly, it's part of many eulogies for Jewish women, right? Almost always a rabbi, particularly if they don't know anything else to say, or if it's a woman who's a leader in the community, they'll use verses from Proverbs 31. And we think of it as something that's often said on Friday evenings in traditional families. And that's why we also have a question about, like, what should we say to men if we want to be egalitarian? But in fact, the first use of ASHET CHAYIL on Friday evenings was in the 17th century. So 500 years after Rabbi Eleaser of Worms came, it was in the mystical circles, and it was everybody singing to welcome the Shabbat bride, the wife. There's a very strong sexual component there. It's only later that it becomes part of the ritual seeming to speak to a particular Jewish woman. So I'm mostly saying that just because it was not as obvious a choice for Rabbi Eleaser of Worms to base his eulogy for his wife on Proverbs 31 as it would have been, or as it would be today, if we were thinking about writing a eulogy for a special or unusual woman. I'm going to do something which is maybe a little bit unfair. I'm going to share the Hebrew, but only really quickly. It's 2 pages, and we are going to work with the English translation, which is mine. And then I'll show you a few places where other people have done other translations. So you can see, and part of the challenge is I can't find a better copy. And there's a number of, there are actually a number of different manuscripts, different books in which this was found, and there are different versions, slightly different versions of it. But you can see here it starts ASHET CHAYIL mi'imsa, which you recognize. Ki ishti hachasida marat DULCIE, right? Or DULCIE. A woman of valor who could find, like my chasida, my pious, my wife, my pious wife, Madame DULCIE, and kind of as you would just go along, and anybody who wants it, so I'll share the whole thing with people individually if you want the text. But you can see throughout it, and more at the beginning, less as we go into the second pages. He's using phrases from ASHET CHAYIL as his skeleton, if you will, at least for the beginning. And then as he gets into the second half, it's actually an acrostic with his name, Eleaser. And that's pretty common in medieval poems. So I am going to work with the English, but I want to let you know that there is a Hebrew. I just couldn't really set it up well. Okay, so I want to start by just by reading it, and as I read it, I want you to think about who this woman is. What is she doing? What is she spending her time doing? What's her relationship with her husband, with her community? So just get to know her a little bit, because this apparently is more or less who she was. A woman of valor who can fight, like my wife, the pious one, Madame DULCIE. A woman of valor is the crown of her husband, the daughter of noble ones. A woman who fears God is praised for her good deeds. Her husband's heart trusts her. Oh, the bold print is when it's a quote from ASHET CHAYIL from Proverbs.
Okay.
She feeds and dresses him with honor. He sits with the elders of the land, learning Torah and making allocations. She does him good and not evil all the days of his life with her. She labors hard to make books for him, and her name is pleasant. She seeks out white wool for tzitzit, and her hands spin willingly. She considers the doing of mitzvot and is to be praised for her observances. She is like a merchant ship in order to nourish her husband so that he can be occupied with Torah. Look to her daughters and be fortunate from her, for her merchandise is good. She gives nourishment to her household and bread to the young men. Her hand reaches out to labor to spin the threads for the books. She is careful with the spinning of threads for the tefillin and megillot, scrolls and parchment books. She is swift as a deer as she cooks for the young men and does the will of the students. She girds her loins and her strength and sews 40 sifrei Torah. She slaughters meat for consumption and sets the table for the gathered. She adorns the brides with good taste and brings them to the chuppah with honor. Gently she washes the dead and sews the shrouds for them. Her hands sew the clothes of the students and the torn books. Because of her labor, they enjoy delightful days. She extends her hand to the poor. She feeds her son and daughters and her husband. She happily does the will of her Creator day and night. Her candle, for which she has made the twisted thread, does not go out at night. In the small sanctuary and study halls, she recites praises. She sings the psalm songs and the Amidah and the penitential prayers. Every day she includes Nishmat Kol Chai v'Kol Ma'aminim. She recites the sections on the incense and the 10 Commandments. In all the lands or all the cities, she instructs women and leads them in beautiful melodies. She carefully orders her prayers morning and evening. She goes early and stays late at the synagogue. She stands for all of Yom Kippur and regulates the candles or prepares the candles in advance. She honors the Shabbat and holidays by being occupied with Torah. She opens her mouth with wisdom and knows what is permitted and forbidden by Jewish law. She sits on Shabbat and explicates Torah with her husband and listens. She is modest above all and wise and faithful. She is careful, pious, and graceful in performing all the mitzvot. From her labor, she acquires milk for the teachers and students. She is knowing and wise and worships her Creator with joy. She rushes to visit the sick and do the commandments of her Creator. She feeds her children and encourages them to learn and worship with awe. She joyfully fulfills the desire of her husband and is never angry at her. Other translations are that she never makes him angry. Her deeds are pleasant and she should be remembered before the rock of eternity. Bind her soul in ever-living, lasting life. Give her the rewards of her hands in the Garden of Eden. We'll come back. The last part is about her daughters, but I want to come back to that when we look at some things about education and also about her as a mother. So I know I sent a lot at you, but what do you notice? What stands out? What questions do you have?
So I see three things about her. She's a kollel wife. She's also a community functionary. You know, she's providing the thread and sewing tefillin and tzitzit and all that sort of thing. And she's a Talmidat Chacham.
Okay, so when you say kollel wife, you mean a woman who has to take care of her husband because he's studying all the time.
Right.
I'm not sure I agree 100%, but let's see what other people are noticing.
Absolutely, I agree. And more than that, the question I have is who pays for all this?
Okay.
I mean, unless she's making a living selling her strings and wool and flax or whatever else she's working.
So you're not seeing her as quite the successful fabric salesperson as the other ASHET.
I do, but again, super mom.
Yes, certainly another super mom. What else are people seeing in this? What else do you remember, Ellen?
She's completely devoted to him.
Okay, what are some of the things that make you say that?
Maybe I'm just saying what Susie is saying, but she's...
No,
that
There-
the
there's a-
partnership is constantly emphasized. She is there with him. She is there
That's
helping him. She is there assisting him. She's right there when he's doing the midrash, which is interesting. She's, she agrees with him. I don't know. Is she also talking? I don't know. But the point is, she's completely intertwined with the husband. And this is very different from what's in Proverbs. I mean, really, as I said, the word children is not mentioned until, nearly the end. So this is daughters and husband daughters, the students, like Susie said, she's part of the community. She's generating all sorts of possibilities for the community, but she is mostly intertwined with her religious devotion and with her husband.
Okay, what else are people seeing there?
She's perfect.
Yeah, but she's dead, so.
I think that I like what Ellen said about partnership. It sounds to me more like she's like the wife of the Rosh Yeshiva, like she and him together are making this whole learning thing happening, and that's kind of her job.
Right, and that was Susie, but that was a bit of what I was challenging you. I kind of think of a Kollel student as being, kind of younger and sort of he's all studying, but she's the wife of the Rosh Yeshiva, and he is a Rosh Yeshiva here.
Mm.
He's already an author at this time, well known, right? Both mystic and halachic within the community. So let me stop for a couple of minutes on her. We can come back to things. So they are living about 100 years after the First Crusade in 1096. And the First Crusade in 1096 was very destructive of the communities in the sort of the French-German area. Worm Spires mines and a lot of martyrdom during that time. It's sort of like the Crusaders said, hey, why do we have to go all the way to Jerusalem? We've got people we can convert here, and if they don't want to convert, we can kill them. So there was a lot of trauma in the community, and there are certain things we take for granted as being old Jewish practices, like Yisker, which come to us during this time period. The communities were so devastated. There was so much loss. They had to create communal rituals for remembering. So this is about 100 years later, and of course crusades are still going on. But the communities have also kind of rebuilt themselves at this time, and there's different kinds of relationships between the non-Jews and the Christian governments and the Jews, and it depended, very much on the city-state that you were living in. Although by this time, whereas earlier in medieval Europe, Jews could own land, now they can't. And we have moved into a period here where money lending is now becoming a Jewish profession. And it is partly because there isn't a whole lot else they can do. But one of the things that's being recognized now, and it doesn't show up in this poem. It does show up in the prose, but I can't get a text of the prose. So all I have is the references to it there. Is that DULCIE was partly making a living as a money lender. And a particular kind of money lender. She would gather funds from other women in the Jewish community to create kind of an investment fund. And then they would be loaning out money, often not so much, although there certainly were women that were loaning money to the higher classes, to the kings or the lords. But she was in a kind of an area where women were loaning money to their Christian neighbors, much smaller, more intimate, for better or for worse, kind of money lending. So that was it doesn't show up in the poem, it shows up other places. That was one of the ways in which she was financially supporting the family that the husband wasn't. as far as we know. On the other hand, a lot of you kind of realized and recognized that it was a family business, right? And in the Middle Ages, both Jewish and Christians in Europe, people lived in family units and family businesses, and there wasn't a separation, right? It's more the Industrial Revolution that leads to the kind of the separation of people from that which they do to make a living. So they made a living through her money lending and through the work that there was kind of a continuum, because, you know, when I said I wore my limud pin because it was concrete in a sense, not only did he teach Torah, right, but they made Torahs, or she repaired Torahs. He was a scribe, Rabbi Eleaser. We don't have any indication that she was doing the writing. She was doing the preparation of the parchments. She was doing the, you know, getting the sinews that would be, you know, she was preparing those to stitch together the different parts of the Torah scroll. And she was repairing them. You know, that was an important piece. You know, it wasn't like you could go out and buy a new Torah, right? You had to repair things. So one way that the family as a whole made money was through the physicality of scrolls, of writing, of sacred texts and books. But then they also, in this case, mostly he and her facilitation, they made a living by taking in students and teaching. Right. And so we have this description of the young men. And if you know about certain parts of medieval Europe, kids went to be apprentices, right? You often didn't grow up in your parents' home. You would grow up in someone else's home where you were learning a trade or you were learning a practice, and you would board with the people that you were learning from, or that learning from, working for. And so I think we have a sense of that. So, we don't hear about maid servants the way that we did in ASHET CHAYIL. I would have to assume that there were some, although we'll see that her daughters also helped in this process. They had their roles, they had their things. But you have a sense that her work was very much hands-on in feeding people, right? In literally preparing the food, all of those kind of things. All of you, or many of you, also commented on her communal role. Okay, so she had a number of communal roles that are associated in some ways more with women, right? Of course, the dressing of brides, hachnasat kala, right? The preparation, bringing brides, giving them wardrobes, whatever was needed, was very much a piece. And you still have that, you still have those groups today of people who help brides to get what they need. The highest form of sort of the biggest chesed honor in a community is the chevra kadisha, right? The people, that's a high honor. In other cultures, it's, the one who touches the dead body is a low status, but it's a high status, and she's involved in all of these aspects. Now, there are a number of pieces, right? And this is where, of course, in the technical sense, right, she's the transmitter of Torah, partly physically in transmitting Torahs, but in a more so personally, right, prayer appears to be very important to her. While we understand that women didn't have the same obligations, and we don't have a sense here of a woman who was putting on tefillin or putting on talit, and there certainly were other women in the Middle Ages who did that or were thought to do that. She wasn't davening at home in her living room, right? She was going to the synagogue. I'll show you a picture at the end of the synagogue that she went to. But she was leaving her home to be in the synagogue to pray, to be part of the service. And she's actually doing, while there is some sense that women should do the Amidah, right? That's kind of the lowest, the rabbis are kind of stuck with women are supposed to pray. They don't know what to do with that they have an obligation to pray. So they say, just the Amidah, or maybe just thank you. But that's not what she's praying that. But she's doing parts of the service like Nishmat Kol Chai and the Psalms and Kol Ma'aminim. These are pieces and the incense. These are pieces which we now find in our Siddur, except for the Ten Commandments, which we now find in our Siddur. But 1,000 years ago, they were not part of the Siddur. These were kind of the individual. This is what pious people did. It wasn't part of your ordinary service. So she's doing sophisticated kinds of prayers in her own davening. She's ordering her prayers, right? She's doing them in specific orders. She's making the time somehow in the midst of all of this. She's going early. She's staying late. It's not that she's spending all day in the synagogue. Clearly, she's busy doing a lot of other things, but there's a sense that she's there. Yom Kippur, she's there all day, right? She's but she, now I'm looking for the line. All right, in all the lands, where did it go? In all the lands, she instructs the women and leads them in beautiful melodies. So this is not a meaningless statement. Right. So we know from a little bit later, 100 or 200 years later, into the late Middle Ages, even into the early modern period, that in various Jewish communities, the women would be in separate rooms, but separate rooms where they might be following with the men, right? They might be listening. They might be in a space where they can physically hear the men's service and they're following. But even in that case, there would still be a woman in the room who would be leading the women in what was going on, who would kind of tell them, we're here, this is what we do. All the way to the point of there were separate rooms for the women, and that there were women who were leading the service for the women, not necessarily for the certainly not for the men, but women who were leading services for the women, and they were leading services, and they were leading different kinds of prayers. This is a little bit early from what we know for this to be widespread in the time of DULCIE. But she's often, these lines are given as a kind of an early example of what will become later more widespread. There is a little bit of biographical information which seems to be known about her, and that she was most likely the daughter of a cantor. Not necessarily the daughter of a rabbi, but the daughter of a cantor, but in any event, which would explain why she was more familiar with the prayers and had a beautiful voice and was able to teach and lead women in the singing as well. There are some people who hold that she's a great granddaughter of Rashi. But I think that's probably one of those, Rashi had daughters and this is a wise woman. And so, it's like everybody's related to Rashi. There's not necessarily evidence that she was related to Rashi, but there is a sense, and we know that most of the women who did have these leadership roles, both ritually and communally, were the daughters of rabbis, the daughters of cantors. They were women that came from educated homes. We know also that she's, she encourages her children, her own children, in prayer as well as everything else. She visits the sick, which is another, another female role. And now whether she was a healer, as women had to be in their own homes, but we know in the Middle Ages there are quite a number of women Jewish doctors. No indication that that's her. She's busy doing everything else. Before we go ahead, I wanna go and introduce you to their daughters, because we're also going to learn things about education and more about the family when we meet the daughters as well. Okay. And you see, of course, this, bind her soul in everlasting life, right? She's there already. Okay. So this is found in some versions and not in other versions, but it's found in other places. This, what I'm putting here is an addendum. So let me, okay. So her name is Dulcie. Did anybody notice that? And one of the daughters is Ballet, or Ballet. My French is not good. And the other is actually, where is she? Now I can't find her, but the other one has a Hebrew name. So even someone as educated and knowledgeable and Jewishly identified, it was much more common for Jewish women to have names that were vernacular. They didn't necessarily have Hebrew names, but Dulcie means graceful somewhere in there, and you see a lot of references to her grace. So now it's about the older daughter. Is it possible to tell you of Ballet, my older daughter? She was 13 years old and modest like a bride. She learned all of the prayers and songs from her mother. Modesty, piety, pleasantness, and wisdom. She did deeds like her mother, this beautiful young girl. She spreads my bed and removes my shoes every evening. Ballet is careful in the house and speaks only the truth. She worships her creator and spins and embroiders. She is imbued with fear, awe, and loves her fashioner completely. Her intentions, her intentions are towards heaven, and she listens to Torah from my mouth. She was killed with her mother and her sister on the night of the 22nd of Kislev. I was sitting peacefully at my table when two crusaders killed them before my eyes and wounded my students and my son. It is not clear. Some say the son was fatally wounded, and it's not clear whether in the end all of his children were killed. Or not. It's not really clear. Is it possible to tell you of my little daughter? Every day she read the first section of the Shema. She was 6 years old and could spin and sew and embroider. And she delighted me with her singing. Woe is me for my wife. Woe is me for my daughters. So when you stop, the sadness, knowing that they were all killed in his house at his table. What have you learned about the family? What have you learned about education in meeting the 13-year-old daughter and the 6-year-old daughter?
They were educated in Torah.
They were educated in Torah by who?
Was it the mother or the father or both?
I think for the most part, it's the mother, although if you imagine that the school is in the house, you can also imagine maybe a little bit, but like Rabbi Yehuda's maidservant, right? Learning by having to be in the rooms, being aware, even if you're not an official student. So it's possible that they learned in both ways. So they're learning Torah. What else are they learning?
The melodies.
Okay, so singing is important here. We have this, and of course, and there's some interesting articles about Kol Isha in medieval Ashkenaz and just how terrible it is, and you shouldn't hear women singing, but clearly singing is important here in this family. Beautiful melodies are valued. but yes, singing. What else?
Skills. So they're supporting the family business, the sewing and the.
Right. So those skills, they're not cooking quite so much, but my guess is they're learning cooking too. So you really have a sense, of course, and this is how learning went for women, is that they learned in the home. And in a sense, the assumption is they're going to be marrying into a family in a similar kind of economic work. And so the skills that they get are both generic enough to whatever family they end up marrying into, as well as specific to certain kinds of trades. And there might be a preference for marrying them to somebody in that particular trade. Ellen?
Well, they're just also completely obedient. I mean, they're little versions of their mother. And that is held
And
up
who
as
are they
something
obedient?
beautiful.
Who are they obedient to?
They're obedient to their mother, who is obedient to their father. I mean, there's a kind of
But who else?
To God.
God.
To God, right?
They're
Right.
deeply
And so
religious.
there is a sense, perhaps, this little girl is spreading her father's bed, which today we worry about, but that was really it's a loving task that a child would do. But there's very much a sense of it's not only through their father, and not even through their mother, right? Malay's intentions are towards heaven, right? She already has a sense of a relationship with God. So that's why I didn't go where I needed to go in talking about the community post Crusades. So at least some part of the Jewish communities in these areas, in response to the trauma, became more pietistic, became more heavenly centered, became more worried about how do we live moral lives, how do we fulfill the observances. But there's also a sense, it's not just kind of paper mitzvot, it really is about wanting to fulfill God's will, right? That there's it's very much, and it's male and female. Okay. Now remember, in Christian culture, while it was also a way of getting rid of extra women, but there was also communal spiritual life for women, right? They didn't have to find a spiritual life only within a family. They could go to a convent. They didn't even have to choose to be religious in a there were secular homes and communities of women who weren't nuns, but they also had a spiritual life of their own. Jewish women don't have that option for whatever reasons. Some of you who were part of who were on when I spoke about Yiftach's daughter and what happened to her, and whether she went into a community of women and was just closed out. But here Jewish women have a very in Hasedi, so Hasedi Ashkenaz is the name of those communities. Okay, they're not Hasidim they're very much not Hasidim in the way that we think of post Baal Shem Tov Hasidism. It's a very intellectual community, very tightly controlled, but again in a very different way. And so I had spoken before about doing work in Sefer Hasidim. So Sefer Hasidim is kind of the manual. On one hand, it's the manual of life in these communities, and it's very pietistic, and it's very controlling of sexuality, and it's very controlling of a lot of things. But on the other hand, Sefer Hasidim, which was kind of written by one guy who was a teacher of the Rokeach, teacher of Rabbi Eleaser. But Rabbi Eleaser also contributed parts to this book, which is why the prose description of his wife's death and his eulogy is found in there. But it's also a description of real things, right? How do we know what's going on? Because it says, so-and-so, this woman had loaned money to a Christian man, and here's what happened, right? That's why it's such an important source of Jewish medieval life. So this is a pietistic community, and DULCIE and Eleaser are very much part of this community. It's what they live in this constantly being attentive to God's will and to willingness to do this is really the community in which they lived, and which were very important in this post First Crusade, but in the middle of the other crusades. So one of the things that, although she's often referred to as a martyr, DULCIE was not a martyr in the sense that we normally think of it. She was a victim of crime. But you'll see that it is written in the language, right? He talks about two marked men, right? Men probably wearing crosses. And so translated it as crusaders. But we know when she was killed, and we know the community, and when they were all killed, we know the community, and we know what was going on politically in that community, and who was the secular ruler. And the secular ruler of Worms at that time actually had kind of passed legislation that Jews were not to be heard. And there were no active crusades in that time period, in that place. And it was not a good thing to kill Jews. And in fact, we know that the people who killed DULCIE and her daughters and injured the others were caught the next day and were executed. That they were brought to justice. So this was seen as a crime against the head of the community. So it is most likely that they knew that she was a woman with money, and that they came in and that they were robbing the household at that point, because they knew that this household probably had money. Now, one of the important roles, and the ways that, in an ironic way, one of the ways that women in the Middle Ages transmitted Torah was by martyring themselves and their children, which is not necessarily an effective way to teach the next generation if you kill them all, but it is a powerful message. And Jews and Jewish women in particular in Europe are at least as prominent in the Crusade Chronicles as men are. And it was the women who made a choice not to, when the community was given a choice. Now, they weren't always given a choice. Sometimes they were just put in a synagogue and burned, or even put in a church and burned. And sometimes they were given a choice. But there are many, many stories about Jewish women in this time who would kill their children rather than have their children convert, and then they would kill themselves. I mean, it's a very, bloody thing. And I think among the most powerful statements and stories that come out of this time are the stories in which the women say to their children, when you go up to heaven, tell Father Abraham that he never completed the sacrifice and I did. Right? It's really this absolute fulfillment of God's will. Now, it is possible to think DULCIE would have done that if she had the choice, but she didn't have the choice. But actually, she did have a certain choice, which is, and I only kind of realized that in this last set of preparing. So here's a piece from the prose descriptions of what happened by Rabbi Eleaser, in which also in the prose descriptions he talks more about her, her financial aspects. So this is a piece of his report. So this is what he wrote. I was sitting at my table. 2 marked men came to us, and they drew their swords and struck my saintly wife, Mistress DULCIE. and they wounded my head and my hand and my left side, and they wounded my students and my schoolmaster. Immediately, this saintly woman jumped up and ran out of the winter quarters and cried out that they were killing us. The wicked ones went out and cleaved her in the head from the windpipe to the shoulder, and from the shoulder to the waist, across the width of the back and front. And the righteous woman fell dead, and I secured the door, and we cried out until help should come to us from heaven, right? So I can't even bear to keep this up, right? But in a certain sense, DULCIE, she made a choice. She was wounded, and she ran out to get help. She saw others in her family. It sounds like a lot of the family was wounded, but she was the one who got up and ran out to get help. And she died outside, which is a kind of an interesting, interesting, tragic, terrible, and yet kind of fits her. Right? She was the one who went for help from the community, and it didn't come in time for her or for her daughters, although it came in time, to save her husband and some of the students at least. And he went on to live for another, I think, 30 years. Never a particularly happy person. I don't have any indication that he remarried, but I would have to double check that. But again, this is, what you can see here is a relationship, right? And we don't often get to see relationships between husbands and wives that were, you could say she was willing to sacrifice her life for her family, but for her husband, to that extent, even though she spent the rest of her life doing that. So there is a picture, I said, a picture of, this is the Warm Synagogue, where she led women in prayer. It's one of the earliest synagogue structures to have had a separate room for women, and it was destroyed during World War II, and they've rebuilt it. So, it's kind of interesting to know again that this was a real woman, and she had a real place and a real space, and in transmitting Torah in all of the ways that I talked about, she has a legacy. Her legacy is everybody's quoting everybody else's articles and these pieces here. But if you read anything about medieval Jewish women, they'll often quote this poem to talk about some of the roles that women were playing in those communities. Although she's a little bit early for some of the things that we see fully develop over the next couple of centuries in Western Europe, and then get transmitted to some of those pieces get transmitted to Eastern Europe. But she's a fascinating, very different kind of ASHET CHAYIL, a different model, and I think I think we have to be grateful to her husband for giving us such insight, and we're exhausted reading about it. Another superwoman. But they didn't have television. They had time to do all this stuff. So I'm really, open to questions, comments about her, about the kind of the tying together of these three women that I did. Susan, were you this? No, okay.
Yeah.
Susie? Yeah.
I don't know if there's any relationship to it, but I hear in the poems that he wrote, I hear echoes of a Sephardi piyut for Rosh Hashanah.
Which one? Not that I would know, but
Achot Ketana. I can send you the.
Oh, that's I'm trying to think of it, but it's certainly a well-known one. Yeah.
But because there, I don't know what the text says about her arranging her prayers, but in Achot Ketana it says not tehiloteha, not tefiloteha, but tehiloteha. And
Yeah, I'll send you the Hebrew at some point.
yeah, I mean, I have it. I have it in my computer.
Okay, so yeah, I'd have to look at that. You know, what was the, you know, what's the time period of Achot Ketana? You know, there is a lot of sharing of material and travel in this time, right? That's one of the things that the Crusades did, was open up travel, and so there might have been that kind of sharing of material as well. I don't know how well known his poem was outside of Ashkenaz, but certainly he was aware of many traditions. Yeah, Ellen?
What was the name of the poem again?
Of
Of
this poem?
This poem that adapts.
It doesn't have a title.
Proverbs. It doesn't have a title. Okay.
It doesn't have a title, so I call it the ASHET CHAYIL of either of Rabbi Eleaser of Worms or DULCIE.
And she dies
it doesn't have a title.
She dies in 1196.
Yes.
So the end of the 12th century.
Yeah.
So right. I'm just trying to, right. So Chaucer, it's the early 1200s. Yeah. I mean, the trope of killing the children rather than having them converted, which is only a violence to Judaism and a violence to the culture, right? Of course, this is so important. I mean, it goes back to, you can say Greek tragedy, but it certainly goes forward to enslaved peoples, you know, and we're just,
right. But it also says, like one could argue, it says that Judaism mattered to them as individuals, and that they felt they would be better off, that they would be worse off if they became Christian women, right? They saw a certain benefit either in this world or the next world. They would probably argue the next world, but I think one could potentially argue the this world part. And Jewish women didn't have access to mysticism in quite the same way that some Christian women did at that point, because Jewish mysticism, you have to be educated. You have to be very knowledgeable. You have to know Hebrew. If a person who's not educated Jewishly starts having visions, right, they're not taken seriously as hearing from God, right? Whereas in some of the Christian communities, right, it was young, ignorant women would have visions of God and they would be saints. Right. So Jewish women had different ways of expressing they weren't allowed to go seeking martyrdom, right? But if it came to them, they made that choice. Now, there's some interesting articles about the difference between some of the choices made by the Spanish Jewish communities to either convert or hide or whatever, as opposed to publicly converting when they had that opportunity. So there's interesting discussions about the differences in Ashkenazic and Sephardic communities and that aspect as well. It's a lot of interesting. Now, so one of the things that preparing for this class, I don't know why now 40 years later, I'm like going back to that moment when, I had to make a career decision since rabbinical school wasn't an issue. Do I go the historian route? Because I had this experience of working with so many first, primary sources. That was one of the benefits of being an undergraduate at the seminary. And I had to make a decision. Do I go the historian route or do I go the social work, Jewish communal service route? So, yeah, I ended up going the social work, Jewish communal service route, but I'm suddenly like rethinking, having pulled out all these papers and seen all this, and it's interesting to find the more, I was looking at more contemporary articles and what's known and what's not known now. What?
2 roads diverged in a wood.
So yeah, and we all have those moments, but sometimes we get pulled back to them. Anything else, Fran? I can't hear you even though you're not muted.
I'm not muted. Can
Oh,
you?
now I can hear you.
Okay. How large were these communities? I was in Barnes one time and it looked like a small community. I mean, were there more than several hundred Jews there?
Right. The community, I don't know the size of Worms at that time, but these were not huge communities. They were, some were bigger cities, some were not. So that's why you get the question, if we have a town that's all Kohanim, are women allowed to have aliyot? Right, so a town that's all Kohanim is not a huge town. It's a couple of families. So again, I don't actually know. We saw the synagogue in Worms. It's and it might have grown over the years. I don't. And remember, the Jews were thrown out of many of these communities. They were brought in. They were thrown out. They were, So we're talking couple of 100,000 years of, not 100,000 years, but at least 1,000 years of history. Sometimes Jews were there. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they all fit in the church to get burned, and sometimes they didn't. So I can't give you an exact answer, but for the most part, they were relatively small. In fact, we focus a lot on European Jewish history, when in the Middle Ages, 90% of Jews lived in under Islam. But of course, we're a Western European centered academic system until recently. So that's why they get a lot more attention than the Jews under Islam.
So how did the change in the relative populations occur? The Ashkenazi communities just grew much faster?
They grew a lot in Poland. I'm not quite sure why after the 1600s. So Poland in the 1200s is the Black Death, and whatever became, Jews were thrown out of there. They went to Poland, which was safer. And despite the Chmielnicki pogroms, killing a lot of Jews in the 1648, you end up with huge population growths, and I don't know exactly why. Hopefully it wasn't all due to the Cossacks, but suddenly there's a population explosion. I think I actually took a course that focused on this, but that was also 40 years ago. So I'm not quite sure why the size changes. Anything else? So you bring me back to all my medieval Jewish history.
Well, I'm just trying to, Kabbalah was, Jewish mysticism was later, no? Luria and this
So there's Jewish mysticism from post Second Temple period, different kinds of Jewish mysticism. Right, the Talmud already knows about chariot mysticism and other kinds of things, and rules develop that keep women, keep the uneducated, even keep young men out of it. So there's Jewish mysticism throughout, but it always is a more intellectual, text-based. There may be physical practices, but it's always text-based. And there wasn't a place for women that and I don't think we know of, maybe it's a question to ask. I don't know of Jewish women mystics early on, or in this period of time.
Was this common, this thing when you get to heaven, tell Abraham that, I carried out the, I mean, was that kind of was that
no,
folk
no, and
talk,
yeah, and martyrdom isn't always encouraged, right? There are 3 mitzvot for which you're supposed to martyr yourself, but exactly under what circumstances even those 3 mitzvot, becomes an issue. But it is these traumatized communities found ways of letting God know that they were angry, right? How much angrier can you be that sending that message up to heaven? You think Abraham's so cool? So I think it expresses those. I think Shalom Spiegel has a book. I just blanked out on the title, and that's all about these retellings of the Akedah. Susie, am I right? What am I thinking of?
I'm sorry.
Is it Shalom Spiegel? There's a whole book on the Midrashim or the later Crusade Chronicles about what happens to the readings of the Akedah when they get combined with martyrdom.
Well,
The
there's
famous book I just blanked out on
I don't know, but I don't know
Okay,
that book. But
figure it.
there are midrashim where Yitzchak dies.
Right. And there's also, it also shows up in some of the readings of the woman who becomes Hannah and her 7 sons, who gets her name in the Middle Ages. I think similar messages show up. So they're not the first to invent that, but they're told in the Crusade Chronicles very poignantly. Yeah.
Stephanie, I just have a question about actually going back to Proverbs. I wanted to know what the quotation mark is there at the very end. Then we get the much more proverbial prayer. I'm sorry to go back. Should I just send you an email?
No. I'm just trying to find my
So I have the JTS, which you're using as well.
JPS. So what's the
Just
word?
at the very sort of three couplets up, as it were. Many women have done well, but you surpass them all.
Oh, so that's
Quote,
the
end
words
quote.
by which her husband praises her, right? Her children declare her husband, declare her happy. Her husband praises her. Quote, many women have done well, but you surpass them all. It's a direct address to her.
I didn't see the open quote. Okay, very good. Thank you. Yep.
All right. So I hope that you've enjoyed meeting these 3 women, thinking about ways in which, whether they're historical or not, thinking about ways in which Torah has been transmitted and taught in ways that are familiar and ways that maybe aren't so familiar. So thank you for learning with me and giving me a chance to learn, prepare some new classes I never did, and get to know old friends as well. So I wish everybody happy. I'll have to go figure out what day of the Omer it is. And it's Wednesday night, so Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Stop
you.
recording.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
It's supposed to stop recording.
Night.
Good night.
Great. How do we get the recording?
Ask Linda, assuming I can figure out how to stop it.
Well, even
Oh,
if
do I
it-
want to